Book 1, Chapter 8 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy55. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 1, Chapter 8 of The Boy and the Girl. Mr. Tolliver shows his weaker side. Suppose Sister Clegg should call her money in. It'll be very awkward for you to have to raise £500 now, said Mrs. Tolliver to her husband that evening, as she took a plaintive review of the day. Miss Tolliver had lived 13 years with her husband, yet she retained in all the freshness of her early married life a facility of saying things which drove him in the opposite direction to the one she desired. Some minds are wonderful for keeping their bloom in this way, as the patriarchal goldfish apparently retains to the last its useful illusion that it can swim in a straight line beyond the encircling glass. Miss Tolliver was an amiable fish of this kind, and after running her head against the same resistant medium for 13 years, would go at it again to-day with undulled electricity. This observation of hers tended directly to convince Mr. Tolliver that it would not be at all awkward for him to raise £500, and when Mrs. Tolliver became rather pressing to know how he would raise it without mortgaging the mill, and the house which he said he never would mortgage, since nowadays people were none so ready to lend money without security, Mr. Tolliver, getting warm, declared that Mrs. Clegg might not do as she liked without calling in her money. She should pay it in whether or not. He was not going to be beholden to his wife's sister. When a man had married into a family where there was a whole litter of women, he might have plenty to put up with if he chose. But Mr. Tolliver did not choose. Mrs. Tolliver cried a little in a trickling, quiet way as she put on her nightcap, but presently sank into a comfortable sleep, lulled by the thought that she would talk everything over with her sister Poulette tomorrow, when she was to take the children to Garum Firs to tea. Not that she looked forward to any distinct issue from that talk, but it seemed impossible that past events should be so obstinate as to remain unmollified when they were complained against. Her husband lay awake rather longer, for he too was thinking of a visit he should pay on the morrow, and his ideas on the subject were not of so vague and soothing a kind as those of his amiable partner. Mr. Tolliver, when under the influence of a strong feeling, had a promptitude in action that seemed inconsistent with that painful sense of the complicated, puzzling nature of human affairs under which his more dispassionate deliberations were conducted. But it is really not improbable that there was a direct relation between these apparently contradictory phenomena, since I have observed that for getting a strong impression that a skein is tangled there is nothing like snatching hastily at a single thread. It was owing to this promptitude that Mr. Tolliver was on horseback soon after dinner the next day. He was not dyspeptic, and on his way to Bassett to see his sister Moss and her husband. For having made up his mind irrevocably that he would pay Mrs. Clegg her loan of £500, it naturally occurred to him that he had a promissory note for £300 lent to his brother-in-law Moss, and if the said brother-in-law could manage to pay in the money within a given time, it would go far to lessen the fallacious air of inconvenience which Mr. Tolliver's spirited step might have worn in the eyes of weak people who require to know precisely how a thing is to be done before they are strongly confident that it will be easy. For Mr. Tolliver was in a position neither new nor striking, but, like other everyday things, sure to have a cumulative effect that will be felt in the long run. He was held to be a much more substantial man than he really was, and as we are all apt to believe that the world believes in us, It was his habit to think of failure and ruin with the same sort of remote piety with which a spare, long-necked man hears that his plethoric, short-necked neighbor is stricken with apoplexy. He had been always used to hear pleasant jokes about his advantages as a man who worked his own mill, and owned a pretty bit of land, and these jokes naturally kept up his sense that he was a man of considerable substance. They gave a pleasant flavor to his glass on a market day, and if it had not been for the recurrence of half-yearly payments, Mr. Tolliver would really have forgotten that there was a mortgage of £2,000 on his very desirable freehold. That was not altogether his own fault, since one of the £1,000 was his sister's fortune, which he had to pay on her marriage, and a man who has neighbors that will go to law with him is not likely to pay off his mortgages, especially if he enjoys the good opinion of acquaintances who want to borrow £100 on security too lofty to be represented by parchment. Our friend Mr. Tolliver had a good-natured Phoebe about him, and did not like to give harsh refusals even to his sister, who had not only come into the world in that superfluous way characteristic of sisters, creating a necessity for mortgages, but had quite thrown herself away in marriage, and had crowned her mistakes by having an 8th baby. On this point Mr. Tolliver was conscious of being a little weak, but he apologized to himself by saying that poor Gritty had been a good-looking wench before she married Moss. He would sometimes say this even with a slight tremulousness in his voice. But this morning he was in a mood more becoming a man of business, and in the course of his ride along the Bassett lanes, with their deep ruts, lying so far away from a market town that the labor of drawing produce and manure was enough to take away the best part of the profits on such poor land as that parish was made of, he got up a due amount of irritation against Moss as a man without capital, who, if murrain and blight was abroad, was sure to have his share of them, and who, the more you try to help him out of the mud, would sink the further in. It would do him good rather than harm now, if he were obliged to raise this £300. It would make him look about him better, and not act so foolishly about his war this year as he did the last. In fact, Mr. Tolliver had been too easy with his brother-in-law, and because he had let the inches run on for 2 years, Moss was likely enough to think that he would never be troubled about the principal. But Mr. Tolliver was determined not to encourage such trifling people any longer, and a ride along the Bassett lanes was not likely to innovate a man's resolution by softening his temper. The deep-trodden hoof-marks made in the muddiest winters of days gave him a shake now and then which suggested a rash but stimulating snarl at the father of lawyers, who, whether by means of his hoof or otherwise, had doubtless something to do with this state of the roads, and the abundance of foul land and neglected fences that met his eyes, though they made no part of his brother's Moss farm, strongly contributed to his dissatisfaction, that unlucky agriculturalist. If this wasn't Moss Fallow, it might have been. Bassett was all alike. It was a beggarly parish, in Mr. Tolliver's opinion, and his opinion was certainly not groundless. Bassett had a poor soil, poor roads, a poor non-resident landlord, a poor non-resident vicar, and rather less than half a curate, also poor. If anyone strongly impressed with the power of the human mind to be triumphed over circumstances will contend that the parishioners of Bassett might nevertheless have been a very superior class of people. I have nothing to urge against that abstract proposition. I only know that, in point of fact, the Bassett mind was in strict keeping with its circumstances. The muddy lanes, green or clayey, that seemed to the unaccustomed eye to lead nowhere but into each other, did really lead, with patience, to a distant high road, but there were many feet in Bassett which they led more frequently to a centre of dissipation, spoken of formerly as the Marquis of Granby, but among intimates as Dickinson, a large, low room with a sandy floor, a cold scent of tobacco, modified by undetected beer dregs. Mr. Dickson leaned against the doorpost with melancholy pimpled face, looking as irrelevant to the daylight as a last night's guttered candle. All this may not seem a very seductive form of temptation, but the majority of men in Bassett found it faultily alluring when encountered on their road toward 4 o'clock on a wintry afternoon. And if any wife in Bassett wished to indicate that her husband was not a pleasure-seeking man, she could hardly do it more emphatically than by saying that he didn't spend a shilling at Dickinson from one Whitsuntide to another. Miss Moss had said that of her husband more than once, when her brother was in a mood to find fault with him, as he certainly was to-day. And nothing could be less pacifying to Mr. Tolliver than the behavior of the farmyard gate, which he no sooner attempted to push open with his riding-stick than it acted as a gate without the upper hinge are known to do, to the peril of shins, whether equine or human. He was about to get down and lead his horse through the damp dirt of the hollow farmyard, shadowed drearily by the large half-timbered buildings, but up to the long line of tumble-down dwelling-houses standing on a raised causeway. But the timely appearance of a cowboy saved him that frustration of a plan he had determined on, namely, not to get down from his horse during this visit. If a man means to be hard, let him keep in his saddle and speak from that height, above the level of pleading eyes, and with the command of a distant horizon. Miss Moss heard the sound of the horse's feet, and when her brother rode up, was already outside the kitchen door, with a half-weary smile on her face, and a black-eyed baby in her arms. Miss Moss's face bore a faded resemblance to her brother's. Baby little fat hand, pressed against her cheek, seemed to show more strikingly that the cheek was faded. "Brother, I am glad to see you," she said in an affectionate tone. "I didn't look for you to-day. How do you do?" "Oh, pretty well, Mrs. Moss, pretty well," answered the brother, with cool deliberation, as if it were rather too forward of her to ask that question. She knew at once that her brother was not in a good mood. He never called her Miss Moss except when he was angry, and when they were in company. But she thought it was in the order of nature that people who were poorly off should be snubbed. Miss Moss did not take her stand on the equality of the human race. She was a patient, prolific, loving-hearted woman. "Your husband isn't in the house, I suppose," added Mr. Tulliver after a grave pause, during which 4 children had run out, like chickens whose mother had been suddenly in eclipse behind the hen-coop. "No," said Mrs. Moss, "but he's only in the potato field yonders. Georgie, run to the far close in a minute, and tell father's your uncle's come. You'll get down, brother, won't you, and take something?" No, I can't get down. I must be going home again directly," said Mr. Tolliver, looking at the distance. "And how's Mrs. Tulliver and the children?" said Mrs. Moss humbly, not daring to press her invitation. "Oh, pretty well. Tom's going to a new school at midsummer, a deal of expense to me. It's bad work for me, lying out o' my money." "I wish you'd be so good as let the children come and see their cousins some day. My little uns want to see their cousin Maggie so as never was, and me her godmother, and so fond of her, there's nobody 'll make a bigger fuss about her, according to what they've got. And I know she likes to come, for she's a loving child, and how quick and clever she is, to be sure." If Mrs. Moss had been one of the most astute women in the world, instead of being one of the simplest, she could have thought of nothing more likely to propitiate her brother than his praise of Maggie. He seldom found any one volunteering praise of the little wench. It was usually left entirely to himself to insist on her merits. But Maggie always appeared in the most amiable light at her Aunt Moss. It was her Ostastia, where she was out of the reach of law. If she upset anything, dirtied her shoes, or tore her frock, these things were matters of course at her Aunt Moss. In spite of himself, Mr. Tulliver's eyes got milder, and he did not look away from his sister as he said, "Eh, she's fonder of you than o' the other aunts. I think she takes after our family, not a bit different mothers in her." "Ma says she's just like what I used to be," said Mrs Moss, "though I was never so quick and fond o' the books. But I think Lizzie's like her. She's sharp. Come here, Lizzie, my dear, and let your uncle see you. He hardly knows you, you grow so fast." Lizzie, a black-eyed child of 7, looked very shy when her mother drew her forward, for the small Mosses were much in awe of their uncle from Dorlcote Mill. She was inferior enough to Maggie in fire and strength of expression to make the resemblance between the two entirely flattering to Mr Tulliver's fatherly love. "Eh, they're a bit alike," he said, looking kindly at the little figure in the soiled pinafore. "They both take after our mother. You've got enough o' girls, Gritty," he added, in a tone half compassionate, half reproachful. "4 of them, bless 'em," said Mrs Moss with a sigh, stroking Lizzie's hair on each side of her face. "As many as there's boys, they've got a brother apiece." "Eh, but they must turn out and fend for themselves," said Mr Moss, feeling that his severity was relaxing and trying to brace it by throwing out a wholesome hint. "They mustn't look to hanging on their brothers." "No, I hope their brothers'll love the poor things, and remember they came all one father and mother. The lads'll never be the poorer for that," said Mrs Moss, flashing out with hurried timidity, like a half-smothered fire. Mr Tulliver gave his horse a little stroke on the flank, then checked it, and said angrily, "Stand still with you!" much to the astonishment of that innocent animal. "And the more there is of them, the more they must love one another," Miss Moss went on, looking at her children with didactic purpose. But she turned toward her brother again to say, "No, but what I hope your boy'll always be good to his sister, though there is but 2 of 'em like you and me, brother." The arrow went straight to Mr Tulliver's heart. He had not a rapid imagination, but the thought of Maggie was very near to him, and he was not long in seeing its relationship to his own sister side by side with Tom's relation to Maggie. Would the little wench ever be poorly off, and Tom rather hard upon her? "Eh, Gritty," said the miller, with a new softness in his tone, "but I've always done what I could for you," he added, as if vindicating himself from a reproach. "I'm not denying that, brother, and I'm not always ungrateful," said the poor Mrs Moss, too fragile by toil and children to have strength left for any pride. "But here's the father. What a while you've been, Moss!" "Wow, do you call it?" said Mr Moss, feeling out of breath and injured. "I've been running all the way. Won't you light, Mr Tolliver?" "Well, I'll just get down and have a bit o' talk with you in the garden," said Mr Tulliver, thinking that he should be more likely to show a due spirit of resolve if his sister were not present. He got down, and passed with Mr Moss into the garden, toward an old yew-tree arbor, while his sister stood tapping her baby on the back and looking wistfully after them. Their entrance into the yew-tree arbor surprised several fowls that were recreating themselves by scratching deep holes in the dusty ground, and at once took flight with much pother and crackling. Mr Tulliver sat down on a bench, and tapping the ground curiously here and there with a stick, as if he suspected some hollowness, opened the conversation by observing, with something like a snarl in his tone, "Why, you've got wheat again in that corner close, I see, and never a bit o' dressing on it. You'll do no good with it this year." Mr Moss, who, when he married Mrs Tulliver, had been regarded as the bucket of Basset, now wore a beard nearly a week old, and had a depressed, unexpected air of machine horse. He answered in a patient, grumbling tone, "Why, poor farmers like me must do as they can. They must leave it to them as have got money to play with, to put half as much into ground as they mean to get it out." "I don't know who should have money to play with, if it isn't them as can borrow money without paying interest," said Mr Tulliver, who wished to get into a slight quarrel. It was the most natural and easy introduction to calling in money. "I know I'm behind with the interest," said Mr. Moss, "but I was so unlucky with the wool last year, and what with the missus being laid up so, things have gone awkward nor unusual." "Ay," snarled Mr. Carr, "there's folks as things 'll always go awkward with empty sacks you'll never stand upright." "Well, I don't know what fault you've got to find with me, Mr. Tolliver," said Mr. Moss, deprecatingly. "I know that isn't a day labor works harder." "What's the use of that?" said Mr. Tolliver, sharply. "When a man marries and got no capital to work his farm but his wife's bit of fortune, I was against it from the first. But you neither of you listened to me, and I can't lie out o' my money any longer, for I've got to pay 500 o' Miss Clary, and there's to be time and expense to me. I should find myself short, even saying I got back all as is my own. You must look about and see how you can pay me with the £300. "Well, if that's what you mean," said Mr. Moss, looking blankly before him, "you better be sold up, and ha' done with it. I must part with every head of stock I've got to pay you and the landlord too." Poor relations are undeniably irritating. Their existence is so entirely uncalled for on our part, and they are almost always very faulty people. Mr. Tolliver had succeeded in getting quite as much irritated with Mr. Moss as he had desired, and he was able to say angrily, rising from his seat, "Well, you must do as you can. I can't find money for everybody else as well as myself. I must look to my own business and my own family. I can't lie out on my money any longer. You must raise it as quick as you can." Mr. Tolliver walked abruptly out of the arbor as he uttered the last sentence, and without looking around at Mr. Moss, went on to the kitchen door, where the eldest boy was holding his horse, and his sister was waiting in a state of wondering alarm, which was not without its alleviations, for baby was making pleasant gurgling sounds, and performing a great deal of finger practice on the faded face. Miss Moss had 8 children, but could never overcome a regret that the twins had not lived. Mr. Moss thought their removal was not without its consolation. "Won't you come in, brother?" she said, looking anxiously at her husband, who was walking slowly up, while Mr. Tolliver had his foot already in the stirrups. "No, no, good-bye," he said, turning his horse's head and riding away. No man could feel more resolute till he got outside the yard gate, and a little way along the deep rutted lane, but before he reached the next turning, which would take him out of sight of the dilapidated farm buildings, he appeared to be smitten by some sudden thought. He checked his horse and made it stand still in the same spot for 2 or 3 minutes, during which he turned his head from side to side in a melancholy way, as if he were looking at some painful object on more sides than one. Evidently, after his fit of promptitude, Mr. Tolliver was relapsing into the sense that this is a puzzling world. He turned his horse and rode slowly back, giving vent to the climax of feeling which had determined this movement by saying out loud, as he struck his horse, "Poor little wench! She'll have nobody but Tom, belike, when I'm gone." Mr. Tulliver's return into the yard was descried by several young Mosses, who immediately ran in with exciting news to their mother, so that Miss Moss was again on the doorstep when her brother rode up. She had been crying, but was rocking baby to sleep in her arms now, and made no ostentatious show of sorrow as her brother looked at her, but merely said, "The father's gone to the field again, if you want him, brother." "No, Gritty, no," said Mr. Tolliver in a gentle tone. "Don't you fret, that's all. I'll make a shift without the money a bit, only you must be as clever in contriving as you can." Miss Moss's tears came again at this unexpected kindness, and she could say nothing. "Come, come, the little wench shall come and see you. I'll bring her and Tom some day before he goes to school. You mustn't fret. I'll always be a good brother to you." "Thank you for that word, brother," said Mrs. Moss, drying her tears. Then turning to Lizzie, she said, "Run now and fetch the colored egg for Cousin Maggie." Lizzie ran in and quickly reappeared with a small paper parcel. "It's boiled hard, brother, and colored with thrums. Very pretty. It was done on purpose for Maggie. Will you please to carry it in your pocket?" "Ay, ay," said Mr Tulliver, putting it carefully in his side pocket. "Good-bye." And so the respectable miller returned along the Bassett lanes, rather more puzzled than before as to the ways and means, but still with the sense of a danger escaped. It had come across his mind that if he were hard upon his sister, it might somehow tend to make Tom hard upon Maggie at some distant day, when her father was no longer there to take her part. For simple people, like our friend Mr Tulliver, are apt to clothe unimpeachable feelings in erroneous ideals, and this was his confused way of explaining to himself that his love and anxiety for the little wench had given him a new sensibility toward his sister. End of Book 1, Chapter 8. Recording by Daisy 55. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Chapter 9 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daisy 55. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 1, Boy and Girl. Chapter 9, 2 Garland Firs. While the possible troubles of Maggie's future were occupying her father's mind, she herself was tasting only the bitterness of the present. Childhood has no forebodings, but then it is soothed by no memories of outlived sorrow. The fact was, the day had begun ill with Maggie. The pleasure of having Lucy to look at, and the prospect of the afternoon visit to Garland Firs, where she would hear Uncle Poulet's musical box, had been marred as early as 11 o'clock by the advent of the hairdresser from St. Oggs, who had spoken in the severest terms of the condition in which he had found her hair, holding up one jagged lock after another, and saying, "See here, tut, tut, tut," in a tone of mingled disgust and pity, which to Maggie's imagination was equivalent to the strongest expression of public opinion. Mr. Rappit, the hairdresser, with his well-anointed coronal locks tending wavily upward, like the stimulated pyramid of flame on a monumental urn, seemed to her at that moment the most formidable of her contemporaries, into whose street at St. Oggs she would carefully refrain from entering through the rest of her life. Moreover, the preparation for a visit being always a serious affair in the Dodsons family, Martha was enjoined to have Mrs Tulliver's room ready an hour earlier than usual, that the laying out the best clothes might not be deferred till the last moment, as was sometimes the case in families of lax views, where the ribbon strings were never rolled up, where there was little or no wrapping in silver paper, and where the sense that the Sunday clothes could be got at quite easily produced no shock to the mind. Already at 12 o'clock, Miss Tulliver had on her visiting costume, with a protective apparatus of brown holland, as if she had been a piece of satin furniture in danger of flies. Maggie's was frowning and twisting her shoulders, that she might if possible shrink away from the prickliest of tuckers, while her mother was remonstrating, "Don't, Maggie, my dear, don't make yourself so ugly." And Tom's cheeks were looking particularly brilliant, as a relief to his best blue suit, which he wore with becoming calmness. having, after a little wrangling, effected what was always the one point of interest to him in his toilet. He had transferred all the contents of his everyday pockets to those actually in wear. As for Lucy, she was just as pretty and neat as she had been yesterday. No accidents ever happened to her clothes, and she was never uncomfortable in them, so that she looked with wondering pity at Maggie, pouting and writhing under the exasperating tucker. Maggie would certainly have torn it off if she had not been checked by the remembrance of her recent humiliation about her hair. As it was, she confined herself to fretting and twisting and behaving peevishly about the card houses which they were allowed to build till dinner, as a suitable amusement for boys and girls in their best clothes. Tom could build perfect pyramid of houses, but Maggie's would never bear the laying on the roof. It was always so with the things that Maggie made, and Tom had deduced the conclusion that no girls could ever make anything. But it happened that Lucy proved wonderfully clever at building. She handled the cards so lightly and moved so gently that Tom condescended to admire her houses as well as his own, the more readily because she had asked him to teach her. Maggie, too, would have admired Lucy's houses, and would have given up her own unsuccessful building to contemplate them without ill temper, if her tucker had not made her peevish, and if Tom had not inconsiderately laughed when her houses failed, and told her she was a stupid. "Don't laugh at me, Tom," she burst out angrily. "I am not a stupid. I know a great many things you don't." "Oh, I dare say, Miss Spitfire. I've never be such a cross as you, making faces like that. Lucy doesn't do it. I like Lucy better than you. I wish Lucy was my sister." "Then it's very wicked and cruel of you to wish so," said Maggie, starting up hurriedly from her place on the floor and upsetting Tom's wonderful pagoda. She really did not mean it, but the circumstantial evidence was against her, and Tom turned white with anger, but said nothing. He would have struck her, only he knew it was cowardly to strike a girl, and Tom Tolliver was quite determined he would never do anything cowardly. Maggie stood in dismay and terror while Tom got up from the floor and walked away, pale from the scattered ruins of his pagoda, and Lucy looked on mutely, like a kitten pausing from its lapping. "Oh, Tom," said Maggie at last, going half-way toward him, "I didn't mean to knock him down, indeed I didn't." Tom took no notice of her, but took instead 2 or 3 hard peas out of his pocket and shot them with his thumbnail against the window, vaguely at first, but presently with the distinct aim of hitting a superannuated blue bottle which was exposing its imbecility in the spring sunshine, clearly against the views of nature, who had provided Tom and the peas for the speedy destruction of this weak individual. Thus the morning had been made heavy to Maggie, and Tom's persistent coldness to her all through their walk spoiled the fresh air and sunshine for her. He called Lucy to look at the half-built bird's nest, without caring to show it to Maggie, and peeled a willow switch for Lucy and himself, without offering one to Maggie. Lucy had said, "Maggie, shouldn't you like one?" but Tom was deaf. Still, the sight of the peacock opportunely spreading his tail on the stockyard wall just as they reached Garland Firs was enough to divert the mind temporarily from her personal grievances, and this was only the beginning of beautiful sights at Garland Firs. All the farmyard life was wonderful there. Battens, speckled and top-knotted, Friesland hens, with their feathers all turned the wrong way, guinea fowls that flew and screamed and dropped their pretty spotted feathers, poulter pigeons, and a tame magpie, nay, a goat, and a wonderful brittle dog, half mastiff, half bulldog, as large as a lion. Then there were white railings and white gates all about, and glittering weathercocks of various design, and garden walks paved with pebbles in beautiful patterns. Nothing was quite common at Garland Firs, and Tom thought that the unusual side of the toads there was simply due to the general unusualness which characterized Uncle Pullet's possessions as a gentleman farmer. Toads who paid rent were naturally leaner. As for the house, it was not less remarkable. It had a receding centre, and two wings with battlemented turrets, and was covered with glittering white stucco. Uncle Pullet had seen the expected party approaching from the window, and made haste to unbar and unchain the front door, kept always in this fortified condition from fear of tramps, who might be supposed to know the glass case of stuffed birds in the hall, and to contemplate rushing in and carrying it away on their heads. Aunt Pullet, too, appeared at the doorway, and as soon as her sister was within hearing, said, "Stop the children, for God's sake, Bessy. Don't let 'em come up the door steps. Sally's bringing the old mat and the duster to rub their shoes." Miss Pullet's front door mats were by no means intended to wipe shoes on. The very scraper had a deputy to do its dirty work. Tom rebelled particularly against this shoe wiping, which he always considered in the light of an indignity to his sex. He felt it as the beginning of the disagreeables incident to a visit at Aunt Pullet's, where he had once been compelled to sit with towels wrapped around his boots, a fact which may serve to correct the too hasty conclusion that a visit to Garland Firs must have been a great treat to a young gentleman fond of animals, fond, that is, of throwing stones at 'em. The next disagreeable was confined to his feminine companions. It was the mounting of the polished oak stairs, which had very handsome carpets rolled up and laid by in a separate bedroom, so that the ascent to these glossy steps might have served, in barbarous times, as a trial of ordeal from which none but the most come off with unbroken limbs. Sophy's weakness about these polished stairs was always a subject of bitter remonstrance on Mrs. Clegg's part. Ventured in no comment, only thinking to herself if she and the children were safe on the landing. "Mrs. Gray has sent home my new bonnet, Bessy," said Mrs. Pullet in a pathetic tone, as Mrs. Tulliver adjusted her cap. "Has she, sister?" said Mrs. Tulliver, with an air of much interest. "And how do you like it?" "It's apt to make a mess with clothes, taking them out and putting them in again," said Mrs. Pullet, drawing a bunch of keys from her pocket and looking at them earnestly. "But it 'ud be a pity for you to go away without seeing it. There's no knowing what may happen." Mrs. Pullet shook her head slowly at this last serious consideration, which determined her to single out a particular key. "I'm afraid it'll be troublesome to you getting it out, sister," said Mrs. Tulliver, "but I should like to see what sort of a crown she's made you." Mrs. Pullet rose with a melancholy air and unlocked one wing of a very bright wardrobe, where you may have hastily supposed she would find a new bonnet. Not at all. Such a supposition could only have arisen from a too superficial acquaintance with the habits of the Dobson family. In this wardrobe Miss Pullet was seeking something small enough to be hidden among layers of linen. It was a door key. "You must come with me into the best room," said Mrs. Pullet. "May the children come too, sister?" inquired Mrs. Tulliver, who saw that Maggie and Lucy was looking rather eager. "Well," said Aunt Pullet reflectively, "it'll perhaps be safer for them to come. They'll be touching something if we leave 'em behind." So they went in procession along the bright and slippery corridor, dimly lighted by the singular lunar top of the window which rose above the closed shutter. It was really quite solemn. Aunt Pullet paused and unlocked a door which opened on something still more solemn than the passage, a darkened room, in which the outer light, entering feebly, showed what looked like the corpses of furniture and white shrouds. Everything that was not shrouded stood with its legs upward. Lucy laid hold of Maggie's frock, and Maggie's heart beat rapidly. Aunt Pullet half opened the shutter, and then unlocked the wardrobe, with a melancholy of deliberateness which was quite in keeping with the funeral solemnity of the scene. The delicious scent of rose leaves that issued from the wardrobe made the process of taking out sheet after sheet of silver paper quite pleasant to assist at, though the sight of the bonnet at last was an anticlimax to Maggie, who would have preferred something more strikingly preternatural. But few things could have been more impressive to Mrs Tulliver. She looked all round it in silence for some moments, and then said emphatically, "Well, sister, I'll never speak against the full crowns again." It was a great concession, and Mrs Pullet felt it. She felt something was due to it. "You'll like to see it on, sister," she said sadly. "I'll open the shutter a bit further." "Well, if you don't mind taking off your cap, sister," said Mrs Tulliver. Mrs Pullet took off her cap, displaying the brown silk scalp with a jutting promontory of curls, which was common to the more mature and judicious woman of those times, and placing the bonnet on her head, turned slowly round, like a dapper's lay figure, that Mrs Tulliver might miss no point of view. "I've sometimes thought there's a loop too much o' ribbon on this left side, sister. What do you think?" said Mrs Pullet. Mrs Tulliver looked earnestly at the point indicated, and turned her head on one side. "Well, I think it's best as it is. If you meddle with it, sister, you might repent." "That's true," said Aunt Pullet, taking off the bonnet and looking at it contemplatively. "How much might she charge you for that bonnet, sister?" said Mrs Tulliver, whose mind was actively engaged in the possibility of getting a humble imitation of this chef d'oeuvre, made from a piece of silk she had at home. Mrs Pullet screwed up her mouth and shook her head, and then whispered, "Pullet pays for it. He said I was to have the best bonnet at Garland church, let the next best be whose it would." She began slowly to adjust the trimmings in preparation for returning it to its place in the wardrobe, and her thoughts seemed to have taken a melancholy turn, for she shook her head. "Ah," she said at last, "I may never wear it twice, sister. Who knows?" "Don't talk o' that, old sister," answered Mrs Tulliver. "I hope you'll have your health this summer." "Ah, but there may come a death in the family, as there did soon after I had my green satin bonnet. Cousin Abbott may go, and we can't think of wearing crape less nor half a year for him." "That would be unlucky," said Mrs Tulliver, entering thoroughly into the possibility of an inopportune decease. "There's never so much pleasure I wearing a bonnet the second year, especially when the crowns are so chancy. Never 2 summers alike." "Ah, it's the way I this world," said Mrs Pullet, returning the bonnet to the wardrobe and locking it up. She maintained a silence characterized by head shaking until they had all issued from the solemn chamber and were in her own room again. Then began to cry. She said, "Sister, if you should never see that bonnet again till I'm dead and gone, you'll remember I showed it you this day." Mrs Tulliver felt that she ought to be affected, but she was a woman of sparse tears, stout and healthy. She couldn't cry so much as her sister Poulette did, and had often felt her deficiency at funerals. Her effort to bring tears into her eyes issued in an odd contradiction of her face. Maggie, looking attentively, felt that there was some painful mystery about her aunt's bonnet which she was considered too young to understand, indignantly conscious, all the while, that she could have understood that, as well as everything else, if she had been taken into confidence. When they went down, Uncle Pullet observed with some acumen that he reckoned the missus had been showing her bonnet. That was what had made them so long upstairs. With Tom the interval had seemed still longer, for he had been seated in irksome constraint on the edge of a sofa directly opposite his Uncle Pullet, who regarded him with twinkling gray eyes, and occasionally addressed him as "young sir." "Well, young sir, what do you learn at school?" was a standing question with Uncle Pullet. Whereupon Tom always looked sheepish, rubbed his hands across his face, and answered, "I don't know." It was altogether so embarrassing to be seated tete-a-tete with Uncle Pullet that Tom could not even look at the prints on the wall, or the fly cages, or the wonderful flower pots. He saw nothing but his uncle's gaiters. Not that Tom was in awe of his uncle's mental superiority. Indeed, he had made up his mind that he didn't want to be a gentleman farmer, because he shouldn't like to be such a thin-legged, silly fellow as his Uncle Pullet, a mollycoddle, in fact. A boy's sheepishness is by no means a sign of overmastering reverence, and while you are making encouraging advances to him under the idea that he is overwhelmed by a sense of your age and wisdom, 10 to 1 he is thinking you extremely queer. The only consolation I can suggest to you is, that the Greek boys probably thought the same of Aristotle. It is only when you have mastered a restive horse, or thrashed a drayman, or have got a gun in your hand, that these shy juniors feel you to be a truly admirable and enviable character. At least I am quite sure of Tom Tolliver's sentiments on these points. In very tender years, when he still wore a lace border under his outdoor cap, he was often observed peeping through the bars of a gate and making minatory gestures with his small forefinger, while he scolded the sheep with an inarticulate blur, intended to strike terror into their astonished minds, indicating thus early that desire for mastery over the inferior animals, wild and domestic, including cockchafers, neighbors' dogs, and small sisters, which in all ages has been an attribute of so much promise for the fortunes of our race. Now Mr. Pullet never rode anything taller than a low pony, and was the least predatory of men, considering a firearms dangerous, as apt to go off of themselves by nobody's particular desire. So that Tom was not without strong reasons when, in confidential talk with a chum, he had described Uncle Pullet as a nincompoop, taking care at the same time to observe that he was a very rich fellow. The only alleviating circumstance in a tete-a-tete with Uncle Pullet was that he kept a variety of lozenges and peppermint drops about his person, and when at a loss for conversation, he filled up the void by proposing a mutual solace of this kind. "Do you like peppermints, young sir?" required only a tactile answer when it was accompanied by a presentation of the article in question. The appearance of the little girls suggested to Uncle Pullet the further solace of small sweet cakes, of which he also kept a stock under lock and key for his own private eating on wet days. But the three children had no sooner got the tempting delicacy between their fingers than Aunt Pullet desired them to abstain from eating it till the tray and the plates came, since with these crisp cakes they would make the floor all over crumbs. Lucy didn't mind that much, for the cake was so pretty she thought it was rather a pity to eat it. But Tom, watching his opportunity while the elders were talking, hastily stowed it in his mouth at 2 bites, and chewed it furtively. As for Maggie, becoming fascinated, as usual, by a print of Ulysses and Nausicaa, which Uncle Pullet had brought as a pretty scripture thing, she presently let fall her cake, and in an unlucky movement crushed it beneath her foot, a source of so much agitation to Aunt Pullet and conscious disgrace to Maggie, that she began to despair of hearing the musical snuff-box to-day, till, after some reflection, it occurred to her that Lucy was in high favour enough to venture on asking for a tune. So she whispered to Lucy, and Lucy, who always did what she was desired to do, went up quietly to her uncle's knee, and blushed all over her neck while she fingered her necklace, said, "Will you please play us a tune, uncle?" Lucy thought it was by reason of some exceptional talent in Uncle Pullet that the snuff-box played such beautiful tunes, and indeed the thing was viewed in that light by the majority of his neighbors in Garum. Mr. Pullet had brought the box to begin with, and he understood winding it up, and knew which tune it was good to play beforehand. Altogether the possession of this unique piece of music was a proof that Mr. Pullet's character was not of that entire nullity which might otherwise have been attributed to it. But Uncle Pullet, when entreated to exhibit his accomplishment, never deprecated it by a too ready consent. "We'll see about it," was the answer he always gave, carefully abstaining from any sign of compliance till a suitable number of minutes had passed. Uncle Pullet had a programme for all great social occasions, and in this way fenced himself in from much painful confusion and perplexing freedom of will. Perhaps the suspense did heighten Maggie's enjoyment when the fairy tune began. For the first time she quite forgot that she had a load on her mind, that Tom was angry with her, and by the time "Hush, ye pretty wobbling choir" had been played, her face wore that bright look of happiness, while she sat immovable with her hands clasped, which sometimes confronted her mother with the sense that Maggie could look pretty now and then, in spite of her brown skin. But when the magic music ceased, she jumped up, and running toward Tom, put her arm around his neck and said, "Oh, Tom, isn't it pretty?" Least you should think it showed a revolting insensibility in Tom that he felt any new anger toward Maggie, for this uncalled for and, to him, inexplicable caress. I must tell you that he had his glass of cowslip wine in his hand, and that she jerked him so as to make him spill half of it. He must have been an extreme milksop not to say angrily, "Look there now," especially when his resentment was sanctioned, as it was, by general disapprobation of Maggie's behavior. "Why don't you sit still, Maggie?" her mother said peevishly. "Little jails mustn't come to see me if they behave in that way," said Aunt Pullet. "Why, you are too rough, little miss," said Uncle Pullet. Poor Maggie sat down again, with the music all chased out of her soul, and the 7 small demons all in again. Mrs. Tolliver, foreseeing nothing but misbehavior while the children remained indoors, took an early opportunity of suggesting that, now they were rested after their walk, they might go and play outdoors, and Aunt Pullet gave permission, only enjoining them not to go off the paved walks in the garden, and if they wanted to see the poultry fed, to view them from a distance on the horse block, a restriction which had been imposed ever since Tom had been found guilty of running after the peacock with an illusory ideal that fright would make one of his feathers drop off. Mrs Tulliver's thoughts had been temporarily diverted from the quarrel with Mrs Clegg by millinery and maternal cares, but now the great theme of the bonnet was thrown into perspective, and the children were out of the way. Yesterday's anxieties recurred. "It weighs on my mind so as never was," she said, in a way of opening the subject. "Sister Clegg's leaving the house in that way. I'm sure I no wish to offend a sister." "Ah," said Aunt Pullet, "there's no accounting for what Jane'll do. I wouldn't speak of it out of the family, if it wasn't to Dr Turnbull, but it's my belief Jane lives too low. I've said so to Pullet often, and he knows it." "Why, you said so last Monday was a week, when we came away from drinking tea with him," said Mr Pullet, beginning to nurse his knee and shelter it with his pocket handkerchief, as was his way when the conversation took an interesting turn. "Very like I did," said Mrs Pullet, "for you remember when I said things better than I can remember myself. He's got a wonderful memory, Pullet has," she continued, looking pathetically at her sister. "I should be poorly off if he was to have a stroke, for he always remembers when I've got to take my doctor's stuff, and I'm taking 3 sorts now. There's the pills, as before, every other night, and the new drops at 11 and 4, and the fluorescence mixture, when agreeable," rehearsed Mr Pullet, with a punctuation determined by a lozenge on his tongue. Perhaps it'll be better for Sister Clegg if she go to the doctor sometimes, instead of chewing turkey rhubarb whenever there's anything the matter with her," said Mrs Tulliver, who naturally saw the wide subject of medicine chiefly in relation to Mrs Clegg. "It's dreadful to think on," said Aunt Pullet, raising her hands and letting them fall again. "People paying with their own insides in that way, and it's flying out of the face o' Providence. For what are the doctors for, if we aren't to call 'em in? And when folks have got the money to pay for a doctor, it isn't respectable, as I've told Jane many a time. I'm ashamed of acquaintance knowing it." "Well, we've no call to be ashamed," said Mr Pullet, "for Dr Turnbull has gotten such another patient as this parish, now old Miss Sutton's gone. Pullet keeps all my physic bottles. Did you know, Bessy?" said Mrs Pullet. "He won't have one sold. He says it's nothing but right folks should see 'em when I'm gone. They'll fill 2 o' the long store-room shelves already. But," she added, beginning to cry a little, "it's well if they ever fill 3. I may go before I've made up the dozen o' these last sizes. The pill boxes are in the closet in my room. You'll remember that, sister. But there's nothing to show for the blouses, if it isn't the bills." "Don't talk o' your going, sister," said Mrs Tulliver. "I should have nobody to stand between me and Sister Clegg if you was gone, and there's nobody but you can get her to make it up with Mr Tulliver. For Sister Deane's never on my side, and if she was, it's not to be looked for as she can speak like them as have got an independent fortin." "Well, your husband is awkward, you know, Bessy," said Mrs Pullet, good-naturedly, ready to use her deep depression on her sister's account as well as her own. "He's never behaved quite so pretty to our family as he should do, and the children take after him, The boy's very mischievous and runs away from his aunts and uncles, and the jail's rude and brown. It's your bad luck, and I'm sorry for you, Bessie, for you was always my favorite sister, and we always liked the same patterns. I know Tulliver's hasty and says odd things, said Mrs. Tulliver, wiping away one small tear from the corner of her eye. But I'm sure he's never been the man since he married me to object to my making the friends on my side of the family welcome to the house. I don't want to make the worst of you, Bessie, said Mrs. Poulet compassionately, for I doubt you'll have trouble enough without that. And your husband's got that poor sister and her children hanging on him, and so given to lawing, they say. I doubt he'll leave you poorly off when he dies, not as I have it said out of the family. This view of her position was naturally far from cheering to Mrs. Tolliver. Her imagination was not easily acted on, but she could not help thinking that her case was a hard one, since it appeared that other people thought it hard. I'm sure, sister, I can't help myself, she said, urged by the fear lest her anticipated misfortunes might be held rebutive, to take comprehensive review of her past conduct. There's no woman strives more for her children, and I'm sure at scouting time this Lady Day, as I've had all the bed hangings taken down, I did as much as the 2 jails put together. And there's the last elderflower wine I've made. Beautiful. I've always offered it along with the sherry, though Sister Clegg will have it I'm so extravagant. And as for liking to have my clothes tidy, and not go a fright about the house, there's nobody in the parish can say anything against me in respect of backbiting and making mischief. For I don't wish anybody any harm, and nobody loses by sending me a pork pie, for my pies are fit to show with the best of my neighbors, and linen so in order as if I was to die tomorrow I shouldn't be ashamed. A woman can do no more nor she can. But it's all no use, you know, Bessie, said Mrs. Poulet, holding her head on one side and fixing her eyes pathetically on her sister. If your husband makes away with all his money, not but what if you was sewed up and other folks brought you furniture, it's a comfort to think as you've kept it well rubbed, and there's the linen with your maiden mark on it, might go all over the country. It'll be a sad pity for our family. Miss Poulet shook her head slowly. But what can I do, sister, said Mrs. Tolliver. Mr. Tulliver's not a man to be dictated to. Not if I was to go to the parson and get by heart what I should tell my husband for the best. And I'm sure I don't pretend to know anything about putting out money and all of that. I could never see into men's businesses as Sister Clegg does. Well, you are like me in that way, Bessie, said Mrs. Poulet, and I think it'll be a deal more becoming of Jane if she have their pier glass rubbed often. There was ever so many spots on it last week. Instead of a dictating to folks as have more comings in than she ever had, and telling them what they're to do with their money. But Jane and me were always contrary. She would have stripped things, and I like spots. You like a spot too, Bessie. We always hung together in that. Yes, Sophy, said Mrs. Tolliver. I remember our having a blue ground with a white spot both alike. I've got a bit in the bed quilt now, and if you would but go and see Sister Clegg, and persuade her to make it up with Tolliver, I should take it very kind of you. You was always a good sister to me. But the right thing 'ud be for Tolliver to go and make it up with her himself, and say he was sorry for speaking so rash. If he's borrowed money of her, "He shouldn't be above that," said Mrs. Poulet, whose partiality did not blind her to principles. She did not forget what was due to people of independent fortune. "It's no use talking o' that," said poor Mrs. Tulliver, almost peevishly. "If I was to go down on my bare knees on the gravel to Tolliver, he'll never humble himself." "Well, you can't expect me to persuade Jane to beg pardon," said Mrs. Poulet. "Her temper's beyond everything. It's well if it doesn't carry her off her mind, though there never was any of our family went to a madhouse." "I'm not thinking of her begging pardon," said Mrs. Tulliver. "But if she just take no notice, and not call her money in, as it's not so much for one sister to ask of another, Tom 'ud mend things, and Tulliver 'ud forget all about it, and they'll be friends again." Mrs. Tulliver, you perceived, was not aware of her husband's irrevocable determination to pay in the £500. At least such a determination exceeded her powers of belief. "Well, Bessy," said Mrs. Poulet mournfully, "I don't want to help you on to ruin. I won't be behind-handed doing you a good turn, if it is to be done, and I don't like it said among acquaintance as we've got quarrels in the family. I shall tell Jane that, and I don't mind driving to Jane's tomorrow, if Mr. Poulet doesn't mind. What do you say, Mr. Poulet?" "I've no objections," said Mr. Poulet, who was perfectly contented with any course the quarrel might take, so that Mr. Tulliver did not apply to him for money. Mr. Poulet was nervous about his investments, and did not see how a man could have any security for his money unless he turned it into land. After a little further discussion as to whether it would not be better for Mrs. Tulliver to accompany them on a visit to Sister Clegg, Miss Poulet, observing that it was tea-time, turned to reach from a drawer a delicate damask napkin, which she pinned before her in the fashion of an apron. The door did, in fact, soon open, but instead of the tea-tray, Sally introduced an object so startling that both Mrs. Poulet and Mrs. Tulliver gave a scream, causing Uncle Poulet to swallow his lozenge for the 5th time in his life, as he afterward noted. End of Book 1, Chapter 9. Recording by Daisy 55. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot.
Book 1, Chapter 10 of The Mill on the Floss. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. Book 1, Boy and Girl. Chapter 10. Maggie behaves worse than she expected. The startling object which thus made an epoch for Uncle Pullet was no other than little Lucy, with one side of her person, from her small foot to her bonnet crown, wet and discoloured with mud, holding out 2 tiny blackened hands and making a very piteous face. To account for this unprecedented apparition in Aunt Pullet's parlour, we must return to the moment when the 3 children went out to play out of doors, and the small demons who had taken possession of Maggie's soul at an early period of the day had returned in all the greater force after a temporary absence. All the disagreeable recollections of the morning were thick upon her, when Tom, whose displeasure towards her had been considerably refreshed by her foolish trick of causing him to upset his cowslip wine, said, "Here, Lucy, you come along with me," and walked off to the area where the toads were, as if there was no Maggie in existence. Seeing this, Maggie lingered at a distance, looking like a small Medusa with her snakes cropped. Lucy was naturally pleased that cousin Tom was so good to her, and it was very amusing to see him tickling a fat toad with a piece of string when the toad was safe down in the area with an iron grating over him. Still, Lucy wished Maggie to enjoy the spectacle also, especially as she would doubtless find a name for the toad and say what had been his past history, for Lucy had a delighted semi-belief in Maggie's stories about the live things they came upon by accident. How Mrs. Earwig had a wash at home, and one of her children had fallen into the hot copper, for which reason she was running so fast to fetch the doctor. Tom had a profound contempt for this nonsense of Maggie's, smashing the earwig at once as a superfluous yet easy means of proving the entire unreality of such a story. But Lucy, for the life of her, could not help fancying there was something in it, and at all events thought it was very pretty make-believe. So now the desire to know the history of a very portly toad, added to her habitual affectionateness, made her run back to Maggie and say, "Oh, there is such a big funny toad, Maggie. Do come and see." Maggie said nothing, but turned away from her with a deeper frown. As long as Tom seemed to prefer Lucy to her, Lucy made part of his unkindness. Maggie would have thought a little while ago that she could never be cross with pretty little Lucy, any more than she could be cruel to a little white mouse. But then Tom had always been quite indifferent to Lucy before, and it had been left to Maggie to pet and make much of her. As it was, she was actually beginning to think that she should like to make Lucy cry by slapping or pinching her, especially as it might vex Tom, whom it was no use to slap even if she dared, because he didn't mind it. And if Lucy hadn't been there, Maggie was sure he would have got friends with her sooner. Tickling a fat toad who is not highly sensitive is an amusement that it is possible to exhaust, and Tom by and by began to look round for some other mode of passing the time. But in so prim a garden, where they were not to go off the paved walks, there was not a great choice of sport. The only great pleasure such a restriction suggested was the pleasure of breaking it, and Tom began to meditate an insurrectionary visit to the pond, about a field's length beyond the garden. "I say, Lucy," he began, nodding his head up and down with great significance as he coiled up his string again, "what do you think I mean to do?" "What, Tom?" said Lucy with curiosity. "I mean to go to the pond and look at the pike. You may go with me if you like," said the young sultan. "Oh, Tom, dare you?" said Lucy. "Aunt said we mustn't go out of the garden." "Oh, I shall go out at the other end of the garden," said Tom. "Nobody'll see us. Besides, I don't care if they do. I'll run off home." "But I couldn't run," said Lucy, who had never before been exposed to such severe temptation. "Oh, never mind. They won't be cross with you," said Tom. "You say I took you." Tom walked along, and Lucy trotted by his side, timidly enjoying the rare treat of doing something naughty, excited also by the mention of that celebrity the pike, about which she was quite uncertain whether it was a fish or a fowl. Maggie saw them leaving the garden, and could not resist the impulse to follow. Anger and jealousy can no more bear to lose sight of their objects than love, and that Tom and Lucy should do or see anything of which she was ignorant would have been an intolerable idea to Maggie. So she kept a few yards behind them, unobserved by Tom, who was presently absorbed in watching for the pike. A highly interesting monster, he was said to be so very old, so very large, and to have such a remarkable appetite. The pike, like other celebrities, did not show when he was watched for, but Tom caught sight of something in rapid movement in the water, which attracted him to another spot on the brink of the pond. "Here, Lucy," he said in a loud whisper. "Come here. Take care. Keep on the grass. Don't step where the cows have been," he added, pointing to a peninsula of dry grass, with trodden mud on each side of it, for Tom's contemptuous conception of a girl included the attribute of being unfit to walk in dirty places. Lucy came carefully as she was bidden, and bent down to look at what seemed a golden arrowhead darting through the water. It was a water snake, Tom told her, and Lucy at last could see the serpentine wave of its body, very much wondering that a snake could swim. Maggie had drawn nearer and nearer. She must see it too, though it was bitter to her, like everything else, since Tom did not care about her seeing it. At last she was close by Lucy, and Tom, who had been aware of her approach but would not notice till he was obliged to, turned round and said, "Now get away, Maggie. There's no room for you on the grass here. Nobody asked you to come." There were passions at war in Maggie at that moment to have made a tragedy, if tragedies were made by passion alone. The essential timmegathus which was present in the passion was wanting to the action. The utmost Maggie could do, with a fierce thrust of her small brown arm, was to push poor little pink and white Lucy into the cow-trodden mud. Then Tom could not restrain himself, and gave Maggie 2 smart slaps on the arm, as he ran to pick up Lucy, who lay crying helplessly. Maggie retreated to the roots of a tree a few yards off, and looked on impenitently. Usually her repentance came quickly after one rash deed, but now Tom and Lucy had made her so miserable she was glad to spoil her happiness, glad to make everyone uncomfortable. Why should she be sorry? Tom was very slow to forgive her, however sorry she might have been. "I shall tell mother, you know, Miss Mag," said Tom, loudly and emphatically, as soon as Lucy was up and ready to walk away. It was not Tom's practice to tell, but he had just as clearly demanded that Maggie should be visited with the utmost punishment. Not that Tom had learnt to put his views in that abstract form. He never mentioned justice, and had no idea that his desire to punish might be called by that fine name. Lucy was too entirely absorbed by the evil that had befallen her, the spoiling of her pretty best clothes, and the discomfort of being wet and dirty, to think much of the cause, which was entirely mysterious to her. She could never have guessed what she had done to make Maggie angry with her, but she felt that Maggie was very unkind and disagreeable, and made no magnanimous entreaties to Tom that he would not tell, only running along by his side and crying piteously, while Maggie sat on the roots of the tree and looked after them with her small Medusa face. "Sally," said Tom when they reached the kitchen door, and Sally looked at them in speechless amaze, with a piece of bread and butter in her mouth and a toasting fork in her hand. "Sally, tell mother it was Maggie pushed Lucy into the mud." "But laws, Marcy, how did you get near such mud as that?" said Sally, making a wry face, as she stooped down and examined the corpus delicti. Tom's imagination had not been rapid and capacious enough to include this question amongst the foreseen consequences, but it was no sooner put than he foresaw whither it tended, and that Maggie would not be considered the only culprit in the case. He walked quietly away from the kitchen door, leaving Sally to that pleasure of guessing which active minds notoriously prefer to ready-made knowledge. Sally, as you are aware, lost no time in presenting Lucy at the parlour door, for to have so dirty an object introduced into the house at Garum Firs was too great a weight to be sustained by a single mind. "Goodness gracious!" Aunt Pullet exclaimed, after preluding by an inarticulate scream. "Keep her at the door, Sally. Don't bring her off the oilcloth, whatever you do." "Why, she's tumbled into some nasty mud," said Mrs. Tulliver, going up to Lucy to examine into the amount of damage to clothes for which she felt herself responsible to her sister Deane. "If you please, it was Miss Maggie as pushed her in," said Sally. "Master Tom's been and said so, and they must have been to the pond, for it's only there that they could have got into such dirt." "There it is, Bessie, that's what I've been telling you," said Mrs. Pullet, in a tone of prophetic sadness. "It's your children. There's no knowing what they'll come to." Mrs. Tulliver was mute, feeling herself a truly wretched mother. As usual, the thought pressed upon her that people would think she had done something wicked to deserve her maternal troubles, while Mrs. Pullet began to give elaborate directions to Sally how to guard the premises from serious injury in the course of removing the dirt. Meantime, tea was to be brought in by the cook, and the 2 naughty children were to have theirs in an ignominious manner in the kitchen. Mrs. Tulliver went out to speak to these naughty children, supposing them to be close at hand. But it was not until after some search that she found Tom leaning with rather a hardened, careless air against the white paling of the poultry yard, and lowering his piece of string on the other side as a means of exasperating the turkey-cock. "Tom, you naughty boy, where's your sister?" said Mrs. Tulliver, in a distressed voice. "I don't know," said Tom. His eagerness for justice on Maggie had diminished since he had seen clearly that it could hardly be brought about without the injustice of some blame on his own conduct. "Why, where did you leave her?" said the mother, looking round. "Sitting under the tree against the pond," said Tom, apparently indifferent to everything but the string and the turkey-cock. "Then go fetch her in this minute, you naughty boy. And how could you think of going to the pond and taking your sister where there was dirt? You know she'll do mischief if there's mischief to be done." It was Mrs. Tulliver's way, if she blamed Tom, to refer his misdemeanour somehow or other to Maggie. The idea of Maggie sitting alone by the pond roused a habitual fear in Mrs. Tulliver's mind, and she mounted the horse-block to satisfy herself by a sight of that fatal child, while Tom walked, not very quickly, on his way towards her. "There's such children for the water, mine," she said aloud, without reflecting that there was no one to hear her. "They'll be brought in dead and drowned some day. I wish that river was far enough." But when she not only failed to discern Maggie, but presently saw Tom returning from the pool alone, this hovering fear entered and took complete possession of her, and she hurried to meet him. "Maggie's nowhere about the pond, mother," said Tom. "She's gone away." You may conceive the terrified search for Maggie, and the difficulty of convincing her mother that she was not in the pond. Mrs. Pullet observed that the child might come to a worse end if she lived, there was no knowing, and Mr. Pullet, confused and overwhelmed by this revolutionary aspect of things, the tea deferred and the poultry alarmed by the unusual running to and fro, took up his spud as an instrument of search, and reached down a key to unlock the goose-pen as a likely place for Maggie to lie concealed in. Tom, after a while, started the idea that Maggie was gone home, without thinking it necessary to state that that's what he would have done himself under the circumstances, and the suggestion was seized on as a comfort by his mother. "Sister, for goodness' sake, let him put a horse in a carriage and take me home. We shall perhaps find her on the road. Lucy can't walk in her dirty clothes," she said, looking at that innocent victim who was wrapped up in a shawl and sitting with naked feet on the sofa. Aunt Pullet was quite willing to take the shortest means of restoring her premises to order and quiet, and it was not long before Mrs. Tulliver was in the chaise, looking anxiously at the most distant point before her. What the father would say if Maggie was lost was a question that predominated over every other. End of Chapter 10.